afternoon, almost everyone. I know that we, based on the conversations that were happening in the breakout sessions this afternoon, I still saw packed rooms, a lot of spirited discussion in terms of the topic areas that we worked through this afternoon. So thank you for joining us for this afternoon's panel. It's been a great day. Tim, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I went to all the sessions for at least a few minutes, and it's just an impressive amount of engagement, not only by the panelists, but the people in the room. So hopefully everyone got something from all those panels and sessions.
Yeah, all right, very good. So you're going to introduce our closing discussion panel?
Thank you, right now.
Okay, very good.
So we're closing the day with a what's next, where are we going in the future? We've heard a lot about what's going on today, right now, in innovation and acquisition. And so to moderate this next panel, we have with us, everybody knows Francis, so I don't really need to introduce Francis. Francis Rose is going to moderate this panel for us.
I want to thank everybody at ACT-IAC for inviting me to be a part of this on behalf of the Government Matters team. They're terrific partners for us, wonderful to work with. They obviously, as you can see by the people that are going to be on the stage with me in a moment, attract newsmakers in government so that you can get terrific information directly from them. I want to welcome to the stage Jose Arrieta of the Department of Health and Human Services. Here he comes. Justin Herman of the General Services Administration is with me. Traci Walker of the USDS, United States Digitals. No, you have to bring the Moxie. No, he put it down. Yeah, you have to bring it. We're all going to take a sip. How many people here have heard of Moxie? By the way, I'm not taking a sip off of that can. There's no chance. There's 0% probability that I'm going to. So Justin is demonstrating that he's a true New Englander by drinking this soda called Moxie, which is a big deal in Maine, I guess New Hampshire. You're from New Hampshire, right? Massachusetts and so on. It's terrible. It stinks. It's awful. But they love it, so there's no explanation for that. Soraya Correa from DHS is here, and last but not least, Jenn Gustetic from NASA is here. You sit anywhere you want except this one. Okay. That's me. I want to start by letting you all know that in an attempt to go digital, as we talk so much about going digital, I decided not to print out my talking points, leave them on my phone, and I note now that my phone is on 14%. So we might get off the subject matter here very quickly. The panel's titled, What's Next? The Future of Acquisition Innovation. And as Tim said, we've talked a lot today about where we are today and where we would like to go. Traci, you made a very interesting observation, I think, as we were talking before we started, that if we say today something is going to be the future of acquisition innovation, then by the very nature of that conversation, it can't be. Because it's no longer innovative, we've figured it out and we've talked about it and so on. So in that context, and don't mean to put you on the spot, and I'm not trying to be a wise guy, how do we have a broad conversation about what acquisition innovation looks like without gaming the system, without figuring out ahead of time what we can and can't do?
Well, I think, yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot there, but anyway.
It was your idea.
I know. I'm just saying that I think a lot of times we use the word innovation, and what we really mean is that we want to do the things that we're doing well and keep improving those processes and really trying to find ways to hone those talents and bring that up, as opposed to some of the stuff that is truly innovative that we haven't even had the ability to wrap our minds around yet of whether or not and how we can buy those things, which is probably what Justin will probably be talking a little bit more about than doing stuff that's what I'm specific to, which is like digital service and agile software development and user-centered design and industry. Those things have been being done for many, many years, and now government is just getting to that. So it's not exactly innovative that we're trying to bring those processes into the government, but what is kind of, I think, the challenge is how do we actually do that with the acquisition regulations that we have to work around and work within, because we are public trust and using taxpayers' dollars to actually do this. And so finding that creative balance, I think, is more what we're looking for, is using creativity and then using the innovation of the new technologies and stuff, and saying, how do we align acquisition regulations, being able to move quickly, and then also protecting the government in lowering risk and stuff, but getting great products out into the hands of our users and stuff as well. So,
Jen, one of the things I've heard you talk about before is the risk of thinking of innovation as a better way, faster way, cheap, whatever, of doing the same thing we've always done, rather than a different way to accomplish whatever the mission or the goal of the organization is, right?
Yeah, so one thing that I was actually talking to someone also in advance of the panel was the notion that sometimes it's the matter that we've been using the same kind of tool to solve the same problem for many, many years, and so we don't think about that there might be other tools that can help us to address that problem. Case in point, I call contracts or grants or prizes, in fact, different people's happy place, right? If you know contracts, you might hate contracts, but you know how they work. And you know the CO that you always go to, and you know that there's some flexibilities that you can build in, and you're comfortable with that tool. That tool seems to be a comfortable tool for you. Prizes might be terrifying to you because you've never used one, you have no idea how to use them, and you have no idea who at your agency actually knows how to run a prize. Same thing with grants, right? Now, some agencies have authorities to do all of those tools, in addition to other transaction authorities and all sorts of good things. They have lots of tools at their disposal. But just because we've always solved a particular, or tried to make progress in solving a particular problem in one way in the past, doesn't mean that there aren't actually different approaches or different tools out there that if we frame the problem differently and put a different vehicle to try to solve that problem, we could attract different solvers to the problem. We could possibly also do it faster and cheaper, right? But that we shouldn't just limit our thinking as well. And I think this is one of the topics for what's next in the future of acquisition innovation, is being not so narrow about the way that we define acquisition. You know, what is in many ways we're trying to solve a problem that programs and taxpayers have. Do we actually need to acquire a solution to that problem? Or are there other vehicles that could address us to solve, or could help us to solve that problem as well, that aren't traditional contracting
So we might be
mechanisms?
thinking about the question too small.
Yep, the question and the vehicle, too small. Really equipping more people to have more tools at their disposal. I worked with Traci years ago on USDS setting up a prize competition to develop training for contracting officers who are acquiring digital services. So it was a really kind of out of the box, of course Traci came up with it because Traci's brilliant, but a way to think about using prizes to actually help address a problem that she had, that the normal way of doing that would have been acquiring a training provider to develop the training in order to equip more digital services COs and how to acquire digital services. She thought about it totally differently to get completely different training solutions on the table.
So you and your colleague Soraya have a table out here where you're talking about PIL, and that's really at the core, what we're talking about is at the core of what you're trying to do. Figure out different ways to do the same thing that
And really
accomplish the goal.
And really understanding what the different tools are and how you can use them, because it's not just a matter of there's a tool out there. There are sometimes limitations to that tool by law and regulation, but also sometimes there are limitations just because of what you're trying to do. I want to take off a little bit on something. So who decided that the word acquisition means contracts? When I look up the word acquisition, it's about obtaining. It's about getting something. It doesn't say it has to be a contract or a purchase order. That's a choice that we've made. That's and that's part of what we're trying to do in the Procurement Innovation Lab. We got to change the thinking. We can talk about these tools, we can talk about innovation, we throw those words around loosely, but it is about the culture that we're living in. We are in a risk-averse culture when you talk about federal government, especially on the contracting, the procurement side, but also we narrow our thinking because of the culture that we live in. So what I've tried to do is change the dialogue and say, we are business advisors. We are not here just to buy things, because that's the reality. Procurement, contracting personnel, actually, when they put their minds to it, they can come up with some really smart ideas and some really great solutions. The problem that we've had heretofore is that we keep relegating that procurement community to the tail end of the process. And my argument is, bring me in at the very beginning. Let's talk about what the problem is. Let's talk to industry about the problem, because we don't always know all of what industry can deliver. And let's start there, and we're going to craft some really smart solutions. And I think innovation is about crafting smart solutions. It's about thinking outside of the box and understanding what the limits of that box is, because there is a box around what is innovation. It's either limited by time, by money, or by resources, but there are limits. But understand what those limits are, and then say, what's the art of the possible within those parameters? So that's what we're trying to push with the Procurement Innovation Lab. It's bring us your ideas, let's test them out, and let's recognize that not everything is going to go well. You know, that's another part of government that we have to think about. We don't understand failure. We don't understand innovative failure. We tend to be hesitant to accept that when you're experimenting, when you're trying something new and different and challenging yourself, some things may not work. And we have to be ready to accept that.
So the problem with that, too, is that it's not just a culture that has been built up because of something inside the agencies. There are 535 people on the other end of town that are helping to beat that into the heads of your people.
Correct.
Justin, that's something that you're trying to counter in the work that you and your colleagues are doing at GSA. Tell me how you're trying to kind of turn that culture piece on its head and get people to understand we can make mistakes, we can blow it, we can try things that we know ahead of time maybe are not likely to work, but we want to make sure, kind of the Thomas Edison model, I didn't fail, but now I know 999 things that don't work.
Right.
Yeah, something, and just listening to everyone sharing today, and something that you keep seeing is a less of a focus on specific tools and solution, and more focus on the problem itself. Like for instance, and I think this illustrates it well, we have a lot of agencies coming to us right now asking about robotic process automation. And they're like, fantastic, we have all these things we want to make faster through RPA. But if you're just taking a broken old process and slapping RPA on it, all you're going to have is a faster broken process. So it's not the tech. Yeah, we have an emerging technology program that really isn't about emerging technologies. It's about widening the toolbox and widening the scope of how we approach the problems that we have. One of the things that we're actually working on is this research around pathways to acquisition, because a lot of people, they might know a schedule, they might know a contract, they might know prizes and competitions, they might have heard about Avi Bender's work with joint venture partnerships, but really what does that all mean and how does it fit together? So we're working on a resource to try to map all that stuff out. And I'll tell you, along the way, we're learning new things all the time, and preconceived notions, just because it's how it's always been done, and it's how it's always been approached, and then we're trying to fit our problems into predetermined solutions, rather than really redefining what acquisitions is, what's the problem, and really opening up the different ways in which we can approach it.
So you, Jose, have done a number of different interesting things throughout your career. Now you're in an agency that has a history of wanting to try different innovation, acquisition approaches, do innovative things. Brian Civic's worked there in the previous administration and forward. How do you apply what you've done other places, Treasury, GSA, and so on, to what they're doing at HHS, and going in there knowing that they have an open mind about trying different things?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing about being at HHS is I walked in and I said, I want to see the architecture of all your acquisition systems, and I want to see how all of the data is fed across the network. And they were like, okay. And I said, listen, guys, one of the things I'd really like to do is this thing called a microservices construct, right? So I'd like to be able to take all the data from contract writing systems. I'd like to put it on a data layer. I'd like to build microservices to drive value for decentralized user base, because don't walk into HHS and say you're going to centralize everything when it's going to cost a lot of money and it's a very decentralized agency. They're very open to that discussion. It's a very unique environment to be able to walk into and openly have a discussion about different approaches to trying to reach a decentralized environment. And what's interesting really about HHS is the first response is not that you can't do that or that you don't control that. It's, okay, well, let's think about that. What are the risks associated with this approach? And that's really the reaction that I've gotten. So it's been an amazing experience. I think that the key, and Soraya hinted on this, Justin and Traci, kind of everyone on the panel talked around it, is as the industry evolves, you have to evolve with the industry base. And this whole idea of economies of scale drive marginal costs to the lowest possible dollar value that you can drive them to and achieve scales. I think you could argue against, I was talking to a World Bank economist the other day, I think there's a strong argument against and towards decentralize. Get your marginal cost to a happy medium where you can actually deliver quality in a decentralized way directly to a decentralized consumer. You can push decision-making authority to the edge, right? If you think about cloud computing or even computers, IBM mainframes, then everybody had an Apple computer on their desk back in the 80s, right? Giant cloud computing centers, and now you have cloud in an actual car. It's decentralized, it's pushed to the edge. I think you can unlock a lot of value if you get over economies of scale and marginal cost and say, what is actual quality and how can we decentralize rules? How can we decentralize authority? And how can we create governance and visibility throughout that network? And I think data is the key. Mm-hmm. And the folks at HHS have been fantastic. I always joke, they haven't kicked me out yet, so it's only been 3 months.
I was going to say, you don't have decades of tenure there yet, but we're getting there. So you talked about data. I'm amazed that I've been at a government conference on a panel, and we've gotten now 17 minutes into it, and that's the first mention of data, because everybody wants to talk about data, about everything. What's the right role for, and this can be for anybody who wants to take it, what's the right role for data in improving acquisition outcomes now or in the future, either way? And what are some ways that these folks in industry can understand the way that you'll use data to serve you better? Anybody? Someone? Megan.
So I can
Yes.
jump in just a little bit. So we were kind of talking a little bit earlier about the cost of acquisition and how much the actual processes that we do to reduce risk, as opposed to kind of getting into that vendor environment where we have a trusted partner that we're going to start working with. And the longer we try to minimize the risk at the front end of the acquisition, it ultimately becomes way more expensive. And the compliance and the controls that we put in there for building of systems sometimes gets in the way of us building the systems. And so if we were able to take and look at data, for example, how much did it cost us to do a requirements traceability matrix report or a testing plan report, and looking at how much that actually costs us on our acquisition versus that's a feature that we just didn't get in our actual system, and saying, the ultimate metric of success is a working system that our end users really like, and saying, okay, all of the processes that we're putting up front are actually taking away from us being able to invest that into the back end. And whether that's at the beginning of the process through very large complex acquisitions that kind of look at, okay, we're very invested in this, so the protest level is a high risk, as opposed to looking at modular contracting and breaking things down to smaller, more manageable chunks and getting things, proving that it works, and then scaling on that success is not something we typically really do in government. But when you look at how much that actually would, if you started tracking the data on that specifically, you'd be able to see that return on investment coming out at the back end when you actually have a working company who's producing really good results. And at the same time, if you're not necessarily producing those really great results, you're also not as hesitant to go back into the acquisition cycle again, because it didn't take you as long to go through it the first time. So that's just one example of the way that data could potentially be used to really look at the acquisition process and say, how much are we actually kind of wasting when we could actually be putting that to building really cool things.
Who's in the best position, do you think, to collect that data? And then who's in the best position, do you think, to analyze it and ask it questions, do things with it?
I think it's both. I think it's both sides. I think it's a program level as well as the acquisition level, and then of course the industry level, because they're the ones ultimately who are going to come back and tell us. And I don't think we really track or capture that very much to say how much of this is actually, kind of the process itself costing us versus what we're actually kind of putting into the building of something or moving to a COT solution and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of things where we're saying we have a lot of funding challenges, but if we kind of look and maybe make it easier to get on and off contract, and then reduce those things, ultimately we'll get that return in the things that we can actually build.
I think this also brings up an interesting, hadn't thought about this question before in the context of SBIR. So I think there's an interesting possible case study on a 35-year-old program called the SBIR program that has had required annual reports to Congress that requires things like how long is the time between application to actual award for a company when they apply across all of these different agencies. And so there's process metrics that are actually collected at the aggregate level across these massive, it's billions of dollars a year that is spent in SBIR and STTR across the 10 different agencies. And there is some semblance of process data created there where they have then been able to set targets. So can we get it down to 90 days from point of proposal to actual notification of selection? Most procurement programs, when I was baselining some other NASA procurement programs recently for some evaluation process improvements we were trying to do, when I mentioned to them that from application to announcement of selections is 90 days for us, they balked. Who in the room does that? 90 days from proposals coming in to actually announcing selections. That's light speed. Light speed, especially for a system that gets between 1,000 and 2,000 proposals in each time. So I think there are some lessons to be learned when you think about, you know, if a regular single program gets in 20 proposals and it takes 9 months to make a selection decision, why does it take 9 months to make a selection decision when we can do, 2,000 of them in 3 months?
So I'm going to weigh in here because also it depends what you're buying.
Right, completely.
Let's not generalize, because that's what we do, and that's what the 535 you mentioned, that's what they do.
Yeah.
They tend to generalize and they try to cut us all with the same pair of scissors, and that's not the way it works. It depends what you're buying, how much you know about what you're buying, and how well you understand your own problem set. And that's what my argument is, and yes, data plays in. I'm big on metrics, and I think it's important to collect the metrics, but I also think we get wrapped up in the metrics. In fact, what I would argue is that I would like for some people to focus on taking metrics on how well oversight works, because oversight is what has led to some of the delays in the processes in the system. Oversight is what really slows us down, and that risk aversion to saying, I'm going to go talk to industry early about what that problem is, and that I am going to spend maybe 3 to 4 months over here studying what it is I'm trying to solve, because I may need to study it. I may really need to understand how the market works, what the problem is, what the tools are that might be available that I could use, or what the innovations are that are out there that I haven't even thought about. I may need to invest that time. That's time well spent sometimes. Not saying all the time, sometimes. And then that time very well spent, we've proven through the Procurement Innovation Lab, shortens your lead time for the procurement. And it does another thing. It cuts the likelihood of protest, because the more time I'm spending with industry up front, the more upfront I'm being about what's the problem, what are the issues we're confronting, what kind of information I really want from you, industry starts self-selecting themselves out. They actually start saying, you know what, this is not the problem that I want to pursue, or I really don't have the right answer. And so ultimately we solve the problem. So I want to qualify that by saying, let's look at what the problems are, because that's always been my gripe in 37 years in government, that we just immediately with a broad paintbrush, we go, oh, it's a procurement problem. Sometimes got nothing to do with procurement. Exactly. It's got everything to do with the requirement, the industry not understanding it, not understanding what the problems are we're trying to solve.
But something I would encourage people to look at, and actually Jose could probably piggyback right off when I'm done saying this, is so federal acquisition and services at GSA isn't just focused on bringing new companies, ideas, and solutions to the table. It's putting its money where its mouth is. Right now there is multiple pilots underway that use what's next, not just to open it up for agency, but to improve the procurement process. And it's something that, again, these pilots are happening right now. Nothing is set in stone. There's actually, in some ways, there's even competing ideas on what the end solution should be, but what you all should be excited about is that there is multiple things underway to tackle problems that we all face on it. And these are through combinations of robotic process automation, AI, even blockchain. And again, so these are things in the works, and it's all about putting data to work for you. There's so much at the end of the day that we know, that we have the information, but making it digestible and actionable for operations is the difficulty. So this isn't even just creating new things, it's taking the wealth of information we already have and to be able to bring what's next by operationalizing it for you.
Jose?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the conversation around, there's two conversations around data. And you have the agility from a technology perspective in the marketplace now to take a series or grouping of systems and overlay you're no longer constrained by systems. You can actually design an optimal business process without saying, well, if we do that, we have to change 6 different systems and we have to run IV and V on all 6 different systems so they work correctly. Like the enrollment, vetting, adjudication, and redress system at TSA. Now, I can overlay that business process with a technology. I can take all of the data off of those existing systems without turning them off, data. And I can actually build microservices in a decentralized manner to support very specific customers. And we're not talking about clicking through systems. We're talking about microservices that execute actions on the top of data that are very low cost, $75,000, $50,000, $15,000 to actually build a microservice that drives an outcome off a data layer that you know is accurate and directly interacts with an end user and a customer that you want to service. We at HHS, you know, when you tie it to a mission space, it becomes even more interesting, right? We have all of these cancer researchers, and they're trying to solve cancer. And they don't want to share information with one another. And they have no mechanism to share information with one another, even if they wanted to. And how do you know that that data didn't change when it was transversed to another person? You now actually have the ability to create a layer where you can suck up all of that data and you can automate analysis off cancer data in real time, something that the human mind can't even do. And fundamentally transform.
I don't know, Jen's pretty good on stuff like that. So Jen's saying not everyone.
And fundamentally transform your ability to find the cure for cancer. But you have to get out of the mindset of saying, well, we're going to build a system.
Right.
Let's bolt another system on top of the 6 systems that already exist. And it only will cost $500,000. But I'm going to have to spend another $200,000 on all the systems that it interfaces with, right? Because if I add 2 decimal places out here, I got to make sure that every system that receives that information has 2 decimal places. Then I got to run IV and V in a test and dev environment to make sure all that works. We're upwards of $2 million, $3 million now.
But isn't the problem there the incentive structure as much as anything? Because the incentive structure, the way it's set up now, is that it's easiest path of least resistance, whatever you want to say, to bolt another system on. That's the cultural thing that Soraya was talking about.
I think that we're getting away from that. I would agree with Jose that I think more and more the appetite is to get away from trying to build these big monolithic systems that may or may not work and that may have limited application. I kind of agree with them. But
it would be nice if we had data on that.
It would be nice if we had data, but you know what? So I'm going to be I'm going to be the disruptor here.
All right.
I love data. I am a data person, and I do use data to make decisions. But I think we also in the government have a bad habit of spending way too much time collecting data and writing reports and generating reports and data-driven solutions that may or may not work. I come from a very basic and simplistic world. Try it, damn it. That's what you need to do. Some of these things are not, don't take this the wrong way, rocket science. I used to work for NASA. Seriously, some of them are not that hard. A lot of what we're doing in acquisition is really common sense. It really is. It is not that difficult.
How does it get so twisted around the axle?
It gets twisted around because people choose to overinterpret regulations, over-comply with regulations. There's fear-mongering. You know, you might get a protest. Ooh, the contractor might write a letter. Get out of that, you know, let's get in there and do. What's the mission you're supporting? Where I work, it's life or death. Guess what? I'm willing to try some new things. And if you want to come slap my hand because I didn't use form whatever, fine, go right, have at it. They already did, by the way. I had that happen. And I lived. See, I'm still here, right? My point is this, that I think sometimes we're overcomplicating the process and we're overthinking it. And that's what the beauty of what we're doing in the Procurement Innovation Lab is. We're not trying to boil the ocean. I'm not going to try to solve world hunger. I'm taking it one procurement at a time. And I'm saying, what is it that you're trying to buy, and what do we know about what you're trying to buy? And if I brought industry in and they sat in front of a panel of people, could they convince you that they're selling you the right thing? That's pretty basic stuff.
And I agree, and what we're doing with HHS Reimagine is exactly the 3 questions that she asked, except we're reaching directly into our contract writing systems and we're saying, what are the terms and conditions of, as an example, medical devices that we've purchased? What is the range of terms and conditions? How many are the same, how many are different? We're doing it automated with an artificial intelligence capability. What are the different prices paid that exist? Right, so now what do we have? We have the terms and conditions, we have the differences in prices paid, we've used natural linguistics processing to do an understanding of the differences in the actual write-up of each of the products. And now when we go to industry to have a discussion, we're not asking them for feedback on, can you deliver this and what is the range of capability that's in the marketplace. We're saying, look, 50% of what we buy, these are the terms and conditions that are included. This is the level of thickness of the gloves. These are, and we know the range of the price points that we've paid. We're empowering in a decentralized way our workforce with that information. It makes the process faster. And it's exactly the 3 questions that you just asked.
But I would go one step further. One of my fears is that maybe what we bought originally, that 50% or whatever, maybe we didn't need those terms and conditions. Maybe if we had taken some time to look at how industry sells it to each other or to others, we might have been able to rely on that, which then simplifies the process and gets it on the table quicker. So that's where I'm trying to go. I agree with what you're doing, but I'm taking it one step further and saying, but is it the way I've done it? Should it be this way? Maybe I just need to be buying more in the commercial vein.
That gets back to what you were talking about earlier, Jen, about what an acquisition actually is, and how we think. The theme that I keep hearing in everything we've talked about so far is thinking bigger. I mentioned it at the beginning, and differently isn't enough, it doesn't sound like. So let's apply that idea to the other topic that I want to hit before we start to get questions from the audience, and there are going to be microphones for everybody to ask questions here in a little bit, and that's the workforce. What does the workforce look like 5 years from now or 10 years from now? I know we don't know all of the mechanisms and so on that they'll be called on to use, but what does the skill set look like? How does that person's mind think differently than what we have today? Justin, you
different and better. And that's part of it, because we see this, there's obviously a lot of research being done on this and what the impact on the workforce is going to be, and there's a lot of focus on, are we automating people? Are we taking it? We're not taking people out of the process, we're taking the robot out of the people themselves and freeing it up so people can focus more of their time better on what they do best. And most of the research, looking at it, and any time there's been such changes through innovation as we're experiencing right now, is creation. And because once you take some of these menial tasks out of the way, and once there's already analysis already being done that perhaps you had teams doing before, now it's already taken care of. What are some of those other challenges at the table that now with our limited resources we can then tackle? So when looking at far as like what's next, yes, it's going to be different, but it's exciting to think about how is it going to be better and what different ways are we going to be able to tackle it.
So we've already seen examples of this being done. We talked a little bit earlier about the training program that I've been working with the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, but it's to create a specialization within digital service acquisition to basically take the buyers and put them into these conversations to say, how do I actually buy this kind of technology or these kinds of services in a way that's the best way to do it. So whatever tool I have available to me, whatever processes I have to work through, and then whatever organizational challenges I have, we're trying to equip them with the ability to challenge all 3 of those. So it's a combination of the technical skills of learning how to actually walk into an agile development contract and say that contractor is not performing because I know exactly what the process is. I don't have to rely on somebody else, a technical person telling me. And then also being able to have the soft skills and being trained that to be able to go to somebody who is challenging from a management perspective or from a kind of a I'm not ready to adopt this yet perspective, and bring them over to it in a way, in a manner that's strategic thinking. And so we've seen where a lot of these graduates from this program, and we're really trying to scale it and launch it this year. Even more, we did a pilot and then we did an MVP, so we're dog fooding here with the idea of innovation and trying to do that. But a lot of the graduates from this are working in the PIL and in HHS and on all of these acquisitions. They're using challenges, and they're also experimenting with new ways of looking at things. So anybody heard that the micro purchase threshold just went up?
Yep.
That's huge for the digital service world and this world that we're trying to go into, because it'll allow you as an agency, so you guys were thinking big, I'm going to go think really small, and look at the fact that how can an agency can go out now and get a license of a commercial product and try it out within their agency. Just go get something, try it out, do an analysis and say, does this work? And then decide how to run an acquisition off of that, as opposed to thinking that we have to wait for everything to kind of come in. The other thing is, one of the contracting officers from this program over at the VA, Mark Jenda, has been using it to look at an API, like using micro purchases for API building, and is that something that they could potentially do? And so it goes to your point of like, what does a microservice cost us to actually do, and can we do it for something like $10,000 and not have to think of it as being one continuous thing, especially if the data is open and transparent and available, inspiring industry to come in and actually kind of help us build this out. And now we have a mechanism to do it, which is looking at something like the micro purchase threshold increasing, and of course the simplified acquisition threshold as well. But I really feel like in the micro purchase world, that's going to help us out, being able to get to some of these commercial services, figure out if they work, and also micro consulting and some of these other things, that it's just going to open it up, I think, the world in terms of looking at things in $10,000 chunks, instead of maybe having to do the first huge procurement and then find out it doesn't work that way.
I think of all of the things that I've heard at this entire conference today, the coolest thing that I've heard is the use of dog food as a verb. That's entirely new to me. As I go,
I mean, just remember, right? If you are armed with the range in terms and conditions and where 50% is purchased and price is paid, how does the role change? All the things that Soraya wants her folks to do? And remember, that's automated. You're armed with that automated. You're not receiving Excel spreadsheets and analyzing it for 3 weeks. Think about how the role changes. Now as a buyer, that's the dialogue. That's where you start. That is your starting point with your engagement with industry, right? That's how buyers in the supply chain world at Flex, that's how they operate. The buyer is operating with information and able to have that discussion that she wants her folks to have. And then the question is this really what we need?
Right.
But you didn't have to spend all the time to get to that point. That is a fundamental change in terms of critical thinking. What are the rules and regulations with how open I can be? What forums should I engage with? How am I going to actually engage with multiple vendors? Should I do it continuously? Should I have an open day? What is the time frame that I should meet with them? And that is a fundamental change in how people operate. And I think they'll be more effective empowered with that information and having that dialogue. But it puts a lot of strain on the governance function that oversees the workforce, because you're not going to be sitting there with them all the time. You're not going to be constantly with them to protect them from some of the things that could go wrong.
Yeah, and I think part of that is that there needs to be an intentional HR strategy alongside envisioning what the future acquisition officer of the future could be. Right? If we're talking about these tools enabling those folks, right? Awesome, but there's lots of other tools, like the things that Justin works on, that also free up other capabilities, where if a person had access to that particular tool suite, which the government would need to acquire in order to get that workforce access to that tool suite, to actually be able to modify their job, you still have to take care of the person and the processes that they're running. So you might have the enabling technologies that free up some of their time, take the robot out of the person, but if those people aren't retrained or upskilled possibly in some of these areas, where now they're not having to do kind of the data processing pieces maybe that they used to have to do. How are we thinking about, through the HR strategies, the training strategies, the skills that are required for that future workforce, so that not only can we be hiring into those jobs, but that for folks that are continuing to develop, they can be developing with those types of capabilities, knowledge, skills, and capabilities in mind.
And I'm sorry, can I add something? It's not just about training, it's about getting them hired too.
Yeah.
Because our hiring processes are just as I would say they're probably worse than our procurement processes.
Oh
That's my
God,
opinion.
wow.
I mean,
They are.
No, they are. They're very difficult. The rules are
Hiring
very
procurement,
tedious.
the taste of moxie.
I noticed you haven't taken a single slug.
Every time I hear someone reference dog fooding, I'm like, are they going to make fun of the moxie?
Moxie, yeah.
Kind of tastes like that.
But I
Who
do-
brought it up? Go ahead.
But I do think that the hiring process needs to be looked at, because I do think that the workforce of the future is a much more diverse workforce, meaning more diverse in talent, and they're going to move around, and I think they're going to move around in the so-called career fields that we have now. In other words, I think you're going to see some career fields get merged a little bit more if we're really smart about it, but I also think you're going to see people moving around in career fields. Well, you got to have a hiring process that enables that allows for that, and does it quickly, effectively, and efficiently. And it lets people move around from agencies and within agencies.
What kind of conversations are you having with Angie Bailey about that?
The same ones that I've always had with every Chico. What do we need to do to move this process along? Why do we have to do it this way? One of the things that I would argue is that while everybody was out criticizing the procurement process, they forgot to look at all the other processes around it. Our financing processes, our security processes, our hiring process. All those things also impact the procurement process. But the focus has been, you're not getting it bought. Oh, and by the way, nobody looked at our budget process, did they? Oh, I'm sorry, I just thought I thought of that one out.
Well, and the government of Canada is actually well ahead of us on this, in that they have been experimenting with a GovCloud and a Talent Cloud activity for the last couple years, where they've been hiring folks that are like free agents. They're called, it's a free agent program, where they recruit folks specifically to be able to work across career areas and tasks. Done some really, really interesting things, piloting very intentionally in Canada about how they set up their workforce to be more of like a gig economy workforce within the Canadian government.
But I do want to point something out. The HR community suffers from the same problem that all of us suffer, right? Yeah. They've got rules, they've got processes, they've got procedures, and there is risk aversion there as well. And there is a price to pay when when an employee sues or something happens. So I'm not trying to criticize the process. I'm just saying we need to look at all of our processes together. Yeah. You can't just fix this one and pretend that everything else is working perfectly, right. And that's what I'm trying to get at.
You wanted to make a point.
Just, HR is important. If you're a leader in this room and you're going to do a proof of concept with one of the technologies that Justin always talks about, or anything, you really ought to start engaging your workforce at that time. Don't do a proof and then say, oh, we got to figure out what we're going to do with the workforce. I mean, because if your proof fails, you've just engaged and educated your workforce on something. Right. And if your proof succeeds, they're prepared for that change. And you can't forget about that they go hand in hand. And if you let one drop by the wayside, you failed your employees as a leader, and you're going to create a significant amount of frustration for them when you do implement a change, if you are successful, that you could have avoided if you just thought about it on the front end.
So that goes to my argument and the argument that I've made for the pill all along, which is the change isn't driven top down. It really starts with the workforce. They are the thinkers. They are the ones that can come up with the really good ideas. You just have to give them a voice and an opportunity to bring you those ideas. They're living it day to day. Most of the improvements that we've made in our processes have come from the actual workforce. And I think when leaders think that they know more than the workforce, that's when they get the rude awakening.
This is something that comes up constantly, and even today. So we provided 3 congressional briefings today on the advancement of AI in government. Same questions came up from both the House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats. How is this affecting the workforce? And part of that we see is going on is, and this happens, and this isn't just in any particular technology, be like, well, fantastic, we have an office of this, or we have a chief something officer who's dedicated to that. Well, shucks, we now have it covered. When really what we need is literacy and awareness. And it's not just for the people that you think are the stewards of this, it's the people who don't know that they're stewards of this. And it's wide and it's diverser than anyone ever thinks. But truly, in order to support, and like you said, it's not just one process, it's everything that surrounds it. We have people are trying to do more with less. They're very focused. They're very protective of turfs. There's all these reasons that keep people very narrowly focused. And it's whether the conversation we had earlier today about needing to widen that focus, even when we look at what are the support mechanisms, we need greater literacy, awareness, and a sense of responsibility that just because it's not in your job title, it doesn't mean that you showing up and participating isn't important. And that's something that we need to do better on.
And the greatest value, I think, in my career, that and I've had wonderful leaders, Jeff Kosis, I worked closely with Soraya in a program, Dr. Nyack, but all of them focused on industry engagement. And if you want to understand the capability that exists in the marketplace, you have a bunch of people that will tell you the capability that exists in the marketplace if you'll just take the time, right? So part of developing your workforce is creating a strategy, and kudos to you for taking it to another level, creating a strategy that drives engagement with industry. Because it is a resource that costs nothing but some time, that wants to engage, is willing to engage, and can see the whole picture of what's happening in your agency. When I first started at HHS, I talked to the industry partner. They can tell me everything that's happening because they're targeting, if they're targeting HHS, they're targeting almost all of our programs. Yeah. And that is a very powerful tool that you have to recognize.
I would also argue that when we talk about, especially some of the larger companies and even the small companies, a lot of what they do is similar to what we do. Yeah. And they deal with similar issues. They just have more flexibilities in how they tackle those problems. But I'm sure that industry is constantly thinking about their workforce, how their workforce is changing, how they can be more innovative, how they can, all these things that we're talking about. I mean, if somebody out there in industry isn't thinking about that, let me know. I want to meet you. Because I know that when we engage in these conversations, they are thinking about these things. So there's a lot to be learned from them about some of the flexibility, some of the creativity, some of the things that they're doing, and how we might be bringing it into our environment. And the last thing that I would say is we also have to raise our hands, we, the leadership of agencies and the people who work in the government. We can't be victims all the time. We can't just say, oh, it's the massive regulations we're under. Oh, it's the process that we follow. Sometimes we have to be smarter and step up and say, so I'm going to tackle that challenge. I'm going to go challenge how you're interpreting that regulation or how you're applying it. We can't just sit back and be victims all the time either.
Yeah, there's actually two things to try to address this, what we've launched recently, and actually any of you can participate in this if you're interested. And again, because you'd be surprised once you talk to people that you haven't talked to before, how just both refreshing and enlightening it can be. One, working with technology accelerator programs. And what word we haven't, or a phrase we haven't heard yet is public-private partnerships, which is such a huge thing. And if you ever check out State Department, they just launched a new accelerator program to build better public-private partnerships called the Bold Line program. So check that out if you want. But we also started a new interagency venture capital advisory group. And actually it's co-chaired by Homeland Security's Venture and Innovation Office and multiple agencies who want to learn from the pockets in government like National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, obviously Homeland Security, different areas where they already have relationships with the venture community. We're now opening up and trying to mainstream that kind of approach and the knowledge from it to other agencies. And then two, through these technology accelerator programs is the opportunity to meet with people who have the solutions that we're going to need, but they don't know how to work with government and they want to know. And that's something that it's not just agencies should be excited about those relationships, businesses, because these are the people you're going to partner with or acquire in order to provide the solutions of today and tomorrow.
Anybody have anything else on workforce before we go to questions from the audience? Clear on workforce? We've solved all of the workforce problems. Because my other fear,
It's solved.
yeah.
First question has to drink the moxie.
Right. So my fear also is that my phone will die and I won't know when it's 4:30 and we'll just keep going till like 8.
I don't think
Because I'm sure everybody would stay, right?
Hopefully
Sure.
you don't use it as a GPS.
I can plug it in my car.
Oh, okay.
So once I get in my car, I'll
Just
be fine.
drive it
But
right up here.
that's a great idea. We should do that. We have microphones. We did? Or you can just shout. Here we go. Here we are. These ladies have microphones. So raise your hand. Tell us who you are and the organization you're with. And then if your question is directed to one person in particular, that's cool. Or if you want anybody to take it, that's also fine. Hi, Trina. It's coming.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
My name is Trina Wetzel. I'm with FERC. One of the things, and this is addressed to the whole panel, so anyone feel free to respond. I think that I can speak for a lot of contracting staff when I say that you're here preaching to the choir right now. So there's no one here who is working in procurement who isn't on board with the things that you're saying. one of the bigger problems is when you talk about change management is having that ability to ensure that upper management, the heads of the agencies, are buying into this too. Because if you have them buying in, it makes it easier for us to come in and propose those innovations to staff. What's being done to get the buy-in of agency managers and heads and such?
So before you answer that, Trina is much too humble. She's not just with FERC. She leads the procurement shop at FERC, so she knows what she's talking about.
Exactly.
Thank you for the question. And whoever wants to take
I
that, go
can
for it.
jump in with that
Please.
real quick. So I think one of the important things that the acquisition community does not do enough is to tell our stories. And so we tell our successes, but we don't necessarily tell good stories about our lessons learned, or when we tried something and didn't really see exactly the result of that. So one of the things we're doing at the digital service is we've created it's called the TechFAR Hub, but it's a knowledge management kind of gathering place. It's aligned a little bit with the GSA's acquisition gateway. You can get to it from there. And basically, around in our specific topic, it's trying to find the case studies and pull together the stories of when agencies have done things like coding challenges, have done other things like that. And what it does, two things. One, we're trying to show you exactly how we did it, because we just don't want to tell you that we did it. We want you to be able to replicate it. But then we're also giving you the tool to be able to go to some management and say, hey, look, they did this over at HHS, or they did this over at VA. They have a very similar structure to what we're dealing with, and this looks very similar. This shows you that it can be done within a government environment, or you can find out who and what you need to talk to find out that somebody else is trying to do the same thing, so you're not trying to be out there, the lone wolves, figuring out how to do this by yourselves. You're seeing that somebody else is doing that. And I do know that a lot of times getting that buy-in that says we're not the first ones trying this sometimes goes a long way to help within the management structure to get the buy-in at their level as well, and then also just sharing that story back. So if you have the lessons learned, if you do have the failures, if you do have those things, you're looking at it in a different kind of tone of the decision-making process is not as big. You're looking at something that is, let's do something for 6 months and figure out if it works, as opposed to saying we now have to commit to a base plus 4 years. And if you make the wrong decision today, it's going to affect everybody for 4 years from now. Trying to look at those a little bit different also lessens the risk that they might want to take on to try something new.
I would add to that, and I agree with everything you said, and I would add to that also we have to stay. One of the things that I've seen us do in the procurement community, especially the leadership of the procurement community, sometimes we don't think strategically. And one of the things that I tried to do, and one of the reasons why in our agency there has been buy-in on what we're trying to do, is because I allied myself with the rest of the CXO suites. In other words, I got my CIO, my CFO, my CHICO, and I'm embracing them and bringing them as part of the solution. So that when we come up to the table with a solution, it's not a procurement person talking or a finance person. It's a team of people, a management group that's talking about how we solve the problems. We approach our customers in more of a management-oriented way. It's also changing the conversation. All too often, I've seen us take the conversation down the procurement rabbit hole. In other words, we go to the FAR or the procurement regs or the management directive that talks about acquisition. We need to start talking about the problem, the mission, and how we solve the problem. When people hear us converse that way, they invite you to the table. And if we sound like a bunch of lawyers, right, or we sound like the Federal Acquisition Regulation, they're not going to talk. And all too often, I've been in the room where I tell people, just tell me the truth. What are you trying to get to? Is there a vendor? Is there a product that you're looking for? Let's have that conversation, the real conversation, and let's get away from trying to pretend that you're really seeking competition in small business because that's what you really want to do. Sometimes you are and sometimes you're not. But I do think it is important to allow yourself to bring yourself together with that C-suite and make sure that people understand that you're a part of a process, because procurement does not work by